Minister, last week, with regard to this bill, I suggested that it's a missed opportunity. What your bill does is reduce the number of TDs by 8. Now, I would ask what the point of that is. It's not going to save us a lot of money. TDs, their offices and their operations and their staff cost the Exchequer just shy of €300,000 a year. Now, contrary to much of the rhetoric, independent TDs come in as the least expensive at just over $240,000. And somewhat ironically, Fianna Fáil TDs come in as the most expensive at in excess of $370,000, about $130,000 more per TD than the independent TDs. So it's not going to save us a lot of money. Reducing by 8 TDs will save us less than €2.5 million. So there's not a lot of money saved. And it's not going to make the Dáil more effective, something it badly needs. I think tonight you could take 20 TDs out of this House and tomorrow morning no one would spot any difference. Now, this bill could have been the start of something new and something radical. We're meant to have parliamentary democracy in this country, but we don't, not in any meaningful sense. Political scientists agree that we have the most centralised cabinet control of any democracy in the Western world. Now, that's pretty damning. Dáil Éireann, as you know, Minister, is constitutionally tasked with holding the Cabinet to account. That's its role. But of course, as you also know, having been in opposition and now being a Cabinet member, the party leadership controls their parties, they control the vote, and as such, the Cabinet controls Parliament, something that it's not meant to do. So how do we see this play out every day in the Chamber? We've leaders' questions, where we see the Taoiseach regularly avoid answering, almost always avoid directly answering the questions, sometimes legitimate, sometimes not, posed by the opposition. Ministers' questions, with respect, Minister, I would say a lot of the time are no better. You see a lot of obfuscation, not always obviously, but you do see a lot of obfuscation from members of the Cabinet, obviously not from yourself, Minister. Private members' motions, which is one of the only chances we have to table legislation and to table hopefully meaningful motions, we don't even get to vote on. All we get to vote on is the government counter motion. Topical issues is something that was welcome, but a few months back, the state paid €2.25 billion to unguaranteed bondholders in AIB. €2.25 billion. And I was unable to get that raised on the agenda of the Dáil that week. And I imagine I wasn't the only TD trying. Though, if I remember correctly, Cathaoirleach, we did have a topical issues debate about sheep worrying up a mountain somewhere. In terms of legislation, we've second stage debates, much like this one, where people like me make speeches like this into empty rooms like this one. And at report and final stage, obviously no opposition amendments are allowed to be taken because the legislation is about to be passed and none of these amendments are okayed by the AG's office. And of course, the Dáil doesn't have access to similar legal expertise. So what about votes? Arguably the most important thing that any of us do in terms of expressing parliamentary democracy. Well, government backbenchers and indeed opposition party backbenchers have no choice about how they vote. The X case, as we all know, is on the agenda for very tragic reasons. Tomorrow there is proposed legislation and every government TD, I imagine, will vote against it, even though, Cathaoirleach, many of them probably agree with it. Now, the Taoiseach said yesterday that he wasn't going to allow a free vote. On this, the most sensitive and personal of issues, he said that Fine Gael don't work that way and he wasn't going to allow Fine Gael TDs to vote according to their conscience on this most sensitive of issues. But he did say, of course, that he wants everybody to have their say. I mean, that's a farce. It is a parody of parliamentary democracy. And it's not normal. This doesn't happen in other countries. A recent report in The Economist showed that this year in the House of Commons, Cathaoirleach, 40% of votes tabled had government members of Parliament voting against their government. 40%. We know it happens quite regularly in Congress as well. Now, the committees, we are told, is where the real legislative work happens. And in fairness, I have seen bouts of cooperation break out at the Finance Committee and at the Justice Committee. But it's not normal, and the committees are not independent. And certainly, they don't hold the ministers that they are dealing with to account in any meaningful way. So what's the point then of Dáil Éireann? What's the point of 166 TDs? Last week I put it to Minister Howland that the government might consider a referendum removing the clause that states that only a government minister is allowed to table amendment to legislation that incurs a charge on the state. It's an absolutely preposterous rule. Imagine a multinational corporation calling together its senior management team and saying, we're in huge trouble, we need to grow our way out of this, but nobody's allowed to suggest anything that costs any money. And Minister Howland essentially said, we would never allow that because if TDs, if members of the Dáil were allowed to make suggestions that cost money, sure, the whole system would collapse in a flurry of populism and nonsense. To which my response is, well, if you're not willing to accept that members of the Dáil could potentially act responsibly, why have it? Now, Article 28, Cahirlach, of the Constitution says, and I quote, the government shall be responsible to Dáil Éireann. With regard to the budget, here's what it says, quote, the government shall prepare estimates of the receipts and estimates of the expenditure of the state for each financial year and shall present them to Dáil Éireann for consideration. For consideration. So do we in Dáil Éireann consider the budget? No, we don't. A 2006 report gave us 0 out of 10 in terms of time given to Parliament to consider estimates and gave us 0 out of 10 in terms of data given to Parliament to allow it to interrogate government proposals. This year we have a crazy situation where the so-called Economic Management Council is even keeping members of the Cabinet in the dark. So there is no consideration of the budget by Dáil Éireann, something which the Constitution says that we're meant to do. So if that's the point, we have to ask the question, what is the point in spending so much money, 50 million euros, what's the point in spending that money on all of us if we don't get to do what we're elected to do and which, in fairness, we all came here to do? The truth is we have an election. This chamber elects a Taoiseach and he or she appoints a cabinet. That's pretty much it. They run the show for the next number of years with their departments. And for the rest of us, there is a very limited, meaningful role. People put in their time, people try and become ministers of state, ultimately ministers. But for most people in this chamber, there is no meaningful legislative role, in spite of how good they are, in spite of how smart they are, in spite of how much they want to serve their country and how hard they work. So in that context, Minister, I would say, what is the point of moving from 166 to 158 TDs? I accept you're constitutionally constrained, but in the wider picture, it's window dressing. We've got 1 TD for every 27,640 people. In the UK, they've got 1 for every 96,000, and in Germany, it's 1 for every 131,000. So the question, Cahirlach, is why do we have 4 times more members of Parliament, TDs, than they do in the UK, 5 times more than they do in Germany? So, Minister, what I would propose, and I appreciate this requires referendum, and it is beyond the scope of your bill, I would propose radically reducing the number of TDs, maybe to 100. Maybe we half the number of TDs. Maybe we bring it down to 83. This would allow for a meaningful role, a meaning legislative role for every member of Dáil Éireann. And I think it would force us all to think very carefully about who we send in here. Now, it would require a referendum, and every member here gets a lot of criticism from the public for a wide variety of reasons, some of it earned, some of it...
1 minute left.
Thank you, Cahirlach. Some of it not earned. So let's ask the people. Let's ask the people if they prefer 100 TDs or if they prefer half the number of TDs, if they prefer 83. There's arguments on both sides. I would say radically reduce it. I would say bring it down to 100, maybe bring it down even further. In conclusion, Minister, I would say, look, the Irish people pay a lot of money for 166 members of Dáil Éireann. Now, contrary, I think, to a lot of the criticism, every single one of those members does their best to represent their constituents, to represent their constituencies, to represent the people who sent them here. And they do that to the best of their ability, but we've got to ask, how many legislators do you actually need in a country the size of Ireland? Do you need 166? I don't think so. Reducing by 8 is not enough. The turkeys, Minister, need to vote for Christmas. I think it's time that this House examined in a very serious way how it is run, and we ask the population just what type of Dáil that they want. Thank you.